Japanese is easy actually. If you have any familiarity with the Japanese language, you probably have heard people saying that it's one of the hardest languages to learn for English speakers, but how do you measure the difficulty of a language? Well, when people attempt to prove Japanese's difficulty, they tend to show the data gathered by the Foreign Service Institute, which is a main organization in the United States that teaches languages to foreign affairs officials. The FSI groups languages into 4 different categories, from languages that take the least amount of hours to learn to the most. Unsurprisingly, Japanese was placed in the 4th category, with an estimated learning time of about 88 weeks or 2,200 hours. If you were to base your difficulty of a language on the amount of hours it takes to learn, then yes, Japanese is one of the hardest languages to learn as an English speaker. But who says we have to base difficulty on time? Sure, it's 2,200 hours of learning, but what if the material you're learning is easy? This is what I'm going to be arguing for Japanese. Sure, it takes a long time to learn, but rather than measuring difficulty on the amount of time, let's measure it by giving a difficulty rating to each aspect of Japanese, including the phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. First, let's start with the phonology of Japanese. If you're new to linguistics, phonology is basically just the sounds that exist in a language. In the case of Japanese, it has one of the simplest phonology systems. For example, the only vowels Japanese has are the standard a, e, I, o, u, found in a large majority of languages worldwide. Granted, the u is pronounced a bit differently from the standard u sound. It's pronounced without rounding the lips, so it's more like u. Although pronouncing it as a regular u shouldn't affect your ability to communicate with someone. Because Japanese uses the standard a, e, I, o, u vowel system, it makes the pronunciation of Japanese vowels extremely accessible to a wide variety of different speakers around the world. These vowels also exist in English, but English vowels are a bit weird compared to non-Germanic languages. So if your native language isn't English, you might want to skip this next section that talks about converting English vowels to regular vowels. Or if you're interested in why English speakers say vowels so strangely when speaking other languages, stick around for this explanation. Alright, so you may think that these pure vowels can't be found in English, but they do exist. They're just a bit hidden. First of all, we can ignore the E and U sounds, as English has those pure vowel sounds in words such as beat, E, and boot, U. However, the A, O, and E sounds are a bit strange in English. You see, they typically are always pronounced with another vowel and never pronounced by itself. For example, the word buy contains the pure A sound, but it's stuck together with the I sound. Buy, buy. The pure O sound is also stuck to other vowels like in the word boat. Here it's stuck with the U sound. Finally, just like A and O, the pure E sound is attached to another vowel, like in the word bay where it's attached to the I sound. This is why English speakers trying to pronounce Spanish words like hola, they tend to say hola, adding this U sound after the O. For an English speaker to pronounce these sounds correctly, they need to remove the second vowel that's always attached to the A, O, and E. To do this, you should try pronouncing these words but cutting your pronunciation short before the next vowel is said. For example, for buy, you can try repeating the word slowly and cutting it off at the end of the word. Buy, buy, ba, ba. Do the same with the English boat and bay. You can practice by saying bow, 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 bay, 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 and that's how you get the pure vowel sounds in English. Anyways, this is mainly a problem for English speakers as they don't have the pure A, E, and O sound. However, many other languages in the world do have these sounds. For this reason, I do believe that Japanese is an extremely easy vowel system since it doesn't have any weird vowels like English. With that said, let's move on to the consonants. The main consonants found in Japanese are m, n, p, b, t, d, k, g, s, z, h, r, y, w. All of these sounds can be found in English and a vast majority of languages around the world. For an English speaker, all of these sounds should be easy, even the R sound. Especially if you're an English speaker from North America, Australia, or New Zealand. This R is called a tap R, which is a sound found in the Spanish word caro. Now you might say, how am I supposed to pronounce the Spanish R sound? How is that in English? Well, good news. If you're an English speaker from the aforementioned countries, then you can do the Spanish R sound. Pronounce the words ladder, butter, chatter, matter. The sound that the D and T make in the middle of those words may sound like a D to your English ears, but they're actually the alveolar tap R sound. Exactly the same sound in caro in Spanish. Remember, this is for North American, Australian, and New Zealand English speakers. Other English accents don't tend to convert the D's and T's into alveolar flaps. So there you have it. These consonants are pretty easy to pronounce for the vast majority of speakers, no matter their native language. Now, if you're familiar with Japanese, then you're probably going to say that I'm missing a few consonants, and you would be right. They're called allophones. Basically, some sounds tend to change depending on what vowel or consonant comes after it. For example, Japanese has the t and the e sounds, but there is no t combination. Rather, the t turns into a sort of ch sound, so we get chi, not t. I'll list out all of these extra sounds. Si, zi, hu, chi, ji, hi, zi, zi, nya, nga, nga. As an English speaker, you don't really have to worry about the sounds shi, ji, chi, ji, since they're extremely similar to English's shi, ji, chi, ji. They're just slightly softer versions. Then we have the he sound, which is when the H comes before the I vowel, but we do this in English as well, so we can check that sound off. Next, we have the n sounds, but this should be pretty natural for an English speaker as well because we do a similar thing. Now we can finally get to the sounds that might be a bit hard for English speakers. First, we have the ts sound, which we have at the end of words like cats. If you're a native English speaker, you already know how to do this sound, but we're usually used to it always being at the end of a word, never at the beginning. So basically, we just have to learn how to make that sound at the beginning of a word. We have a similar situation with z. This sound can be found at the end of words like pads, but you just have to learn how to pronounce it at the beginning of a word rather than at the end. Z, z. Finally, we have the h sound, which is basically just an F sound, but without touching your teeth with your lips, in between a h and a f sound. H, h. Overall, English speakers should be able to pronounce all of these extra consonants fairly easily. Even the ones that we don't have like h are still pretty easy to learn. This makes Japanese pronunciation so much easier to learn for English speakers, as we don't have to learn complicated sounds like the Spanish's r or the French's r or the tones in Mandarin. But that's not all that makes Japanese pronunciation so easy. Let's look at phonotactics, which are the placement of these sounds. Typically, the more consonant clusters there are, the harder it is to pronounce. For example, a word like strengths is much harder than a word like mop, since there are 3 consonants smushed together at the start and the end of the syllable, while mop simply has a consonant vowel consonant structure. Thankfully, Japanese has really simple phonotactics. Japanese syllables will never end in a consonant except if it's an N sound. This is why in Japanese, McDonald's is pronounced as McDonald's, since the k, l, and d sounds cannot end a syllable. This, of course, makes it harder for Japanese speakers to pronounce words in other languages with consonant clusters, but makes it easier for us speakers of languages with more complex phonotactics. Also, Japanese really only has one type of consonant cluster, and that is having a y sound after the beginning of a consonant, like kya, nya. In general, this should also be a pretty easy sound to produce for most people. Overall, it seems that Japanese phonology is relatively simple compared to many languages around the world. The only languages that I can think of that might have simpler phonology than Japanese would be the Polynesian languages, like Hawaiian. Alright, so we looked at the vowels, which include the 5 standard vowels, a, e, i, o, u. Additionally, the main consonants of the language are extremely common worldwide, making it pretty easy to pronounce for the vast majority of individuals. Even if we include the changes of sound like the th turning into a chi, it still does not prove to be extremely difficult. If I were to rank the phonology of Japanese on a difficulty scale from 1 to 5 stars, it would easily be a 5. The next thing we should look at is Japanese morphology. Morphology is basically the forms that words can take. For example, the word bird can have the s attached to the end of it to yield birds, indicating that it is plural. This is one example of morphology, where the word bird is turned into a different form with the plural s. English has a relatively simple morphology, unlike languages like German. I would explain German's case system, but it's probably better if I just showed you. Here's a graph of all the various forms that words can take depending on their gender, of which there are 3, masculine, feminine, and neuter. Then you must also take into account whether it's plural. And finally, you also have to account for whether the noun is being used as a nominative, accusative, dative, or genitive. This yields 16 different forms of the same noun, but German has merged some of these, so we get a total of 8 different forms. This may seem like a lot, but there are languages with even more forms for nouns. English is much simpler in terms of cases, but there are still some forms we still use today. The possessive apostrophe s is a genitive form of a noun. Also, pronouns have different forms depending on how they're used in a sentence, like I, me, my, mine, myself. Now how about Japanese morphology? Thankfully, it's even simpler than English. To form a possessive, you would use the word no, similar to how of is used in English. You don't have to change or add anything to the word itself to make it possessive. Also, there's no different versions of pronouns when it comes to its role in a sentence. For example, in English, we have I, me, my, and mine. Meanwhile, Japanese simply can use the same exact pronoun for each case, watashi. To illustrate how Japanese does this, here are some translations of sentences. Watashi wa taberu, I eat. Kare wa watashi o keru, he kicked me. Watashi no inu wa hone ga suki, my dog likes bones. See how watashi stayed the same in each case, but in English it changes from I, me, and my. Now let's look at plurals. Unlike English that uses an s at the end of words to indicate its plurality, Japanese doesn't really have this. So if there's more than one cat, it is up to the speaker to clarify the amount of cats there were, if it is not clear from the context. This may seem strange at first, but personally, after learning Japanese for a long time, I realized how unnecessary plural markers can be when you simply can use the context. Now, there are some plural markers that exist in Japanese, like tachi and ra, but they are limited to a small amount of nouns. Alright, adjectives. One last thing I wanted to mention about Japanese morphology is how there are 2 different types of adjectives, na adjectives and e adjectives. For every new adjective you learn, you need to learn whether it's a na adjective or an e adjective. Thankfully, this is fairly easy to do, as e adjectives end in an e syllable. There are some tricky words like kirei, which ends in an e sound, but it's a na adjective, but they're slightly uncommon. So how does this all impact the difficulty of Japanese? Because the language does not have gender, cases, and not many suffixes, I would say that Japanese morphology is fairly easy. Because of this, learners will not have to go through the huge tables attempting to memorize all the various forms of a single word. However, there are two separate categories of adjectives, which have different grammatical rules, so that can be a little tricky. If I were to rate the difficulty of Japanese from 1 to 5, I would probably put it around 4 or 4.5, because the morphology is pretty easy, but there are a few things here and there that can be tricky. Alright, so now we can get into the syntax of Japanese, which is basically the grammar. Now, is Japanese grammar hard? Personally, I wouldn't say it's hard, just very different. For example, English is an SVO language, meaning that the basic order of sentences goes from subject, verb, then object. Meanwhile, Japanese is an SOV language, meaning that the basic order of sentences goes from subject, object, then verb. Let's take a look at a Japanese sentence and directly translate it into English. 今日私は魚を食べました. Today, I fish ate. Technically speaking, you don't even have to follow this order in Japanese. As long as the verb is last, your sentence should be grammatically correct. So you could have the object before the subject if you wanted to. This is because Japanese has specific words that indicate what a noun is doing. The wa particle indicates the topic or the doer of the action in this case, while the o particle indicates the object of the sentence. So even if you had the order fish I ate, as long as you place the wa and o correctly, it's grammatically correct, although it may sound a little odd since you're putting emphasis on the object. Compare this with German, where you have to memorize every form of a word if you want it to be the subject, object of the sentence, and whatnot, while Japanese just has wa and o. Another aspect of Japanese grammar that I love is that it's agglutinative. This means that you just add meaning to words by sticking on extra endings, like Legos. For example, take the verb to understand, which is wakaru. To turn this into I do not understand, you simply change the ru to ra, then attach the nai to get wakaranai. Now, to make it past tense, I did not understand, remove the e at the end and replace it with katta to get wakaranakatta. But we're not done yet. We can add the ra to the end of this to make the phrase if/when I don't understand. Wakaranakatta ra. This may seem daunting, but it's quite intuitive if you think about it, as it's pretty consistent. With only one word, you have conveyed the same amount of meaning as the English phrase if and when I do not understand, which includes 5 words rather than 1. One thing I will say, however, is that there are 2 different types of verbs, and the conjugation of them changes depending on which type they are. However, the rules of this are really consistent. In fact, did you know that there are only really 2 irregular verbs in the entire language? These are to come and to do. Maybe 4 irregular verbs if you include to go and to be, which have only 1 conjugation irregularity, but compare that to English that has around 638 irregular verbs to learn. I'll leave a link to the list of that in the description. I would argue that the more consistent a language is and the less exceptions there are, the easier it is. Sure, you have to learn all these new rules of Japanese conjugation, but once you learn them, you can be pretty confident that every verb you conjugate will be correct, unlike English, Spanish, and many other European languages where you have to memorize through brute force every irregular conjugation, despite having learned a rule before. Overall, I would say yes, Japanese syntax is extremely different from English syntax. However, it's so consistent that you only really have to memorize one rule and then you'll be able to apply it everywhere. You don't have to worry much about exceptions the majority of the time. I mean, there's exceptions here and there, but if we're comparing Japanese to languages like English, Arabic, or Spanish, then Japanese is a cakewalk. If I were to give a rating from hard to easy on a scale from 1 to 5, I would give Japanese syntax a score of around 4. It's different for sure, but the consistency and the flexibility of word order helps learners a huge amount. Now we get into semantics and pragmatics. Semantics is the meaning of words, while pragmatics is more about the meaning of words in the context of the conversation. Here's an area of Japanese where I will admit that it's pretty difficult, especially for an English speaker. There are a plethora of grammatical concepts that will be hard to explain to an English speaker. The reason I don't mention this in the grammar section is because it's easy to use these words and make a grammatically correct sentence, but to use them correctly within the right social context is difficult. For example, one thing I struggled with greatly and still struggle with, in fact, is that there are 4 different ways of saying if. As an English speaker, it's really difficult to understand when I have to use one of the 4 ifs, since we only have one way of saying if. There's to, which is used for if-then statements that involve natural order of events, like if it rains, it will get wet. There's the verb ending eba, which is used for hypothetical situations, I think. There's also dara, which gives a mix of like if-when. Finally, there's nara, which is an if word that has a connotation of if that is the case. As you can see, conjugating a verb or adding these words to sentences won't be the problem. The issue lies knowing the social context in which these words need to be used. Even now, I still struggle with this, and I don't really know if I explain them 100% correctly. This is just one example of how semantics and pragmatics can be difficult in Japanese. The fact that a singular concept like if can be split into 4 more nuanced versions of if is really hard to wrap your head around. Another difficult aspect of Japanese is the fact that verbs are conjugated based on your social standing in the context of you as the speaker and the listener. Sure, the conjugations for these are easy to learn and apply because it's consistent, but will you know exactly when you have to use the different conjugations? To learn these nuances, you'll have to immerse yourself in Japanese culture, as without having a good grasp of the culture, you will not know when to use certain conjugations. Additionally, there's the issue of pronouns and honorifics. Sure, you can easily learn the various different ways of saying I, watashi, atashi, boku, ore, etc. But will you know when you have to use each of these? Do you know if you can say them? They're all pretty easy to use grammatically speaking. I mean, it's just the word I, but you need to have a good cultural understanding of Japan to know when and why they're used. Finally, there are even sometimes whole other words that are used when you're being humble or polite. Unfortunately for tourists, this language is extremely common in customer service, which are the individuals you probably will speak to the most during your trip in Japan. Just to illustrate how different this type of humble language is compared to typical Japanese, take a look at this example. To say to see, you would typically use the word miru, or if you're talking to a stranger and you want to be a little more polite, you might make it mimasu. If, however, a person in customer service is talking about you seeing something, they would say goran ni narimasu. And if the customer service person is talking about themselves seeing something, they would say haiken shimasu. Just with this, you can see just how different the forms are depending on who you're talking to, who you're talking about, and the context of the situation. Overall, I would say the hardest part about learning the Japanese language isn't necessarily the language itself in terms of grammar, vocabulary, and whatnot. It's being familiar enough with the Japanese culture to know when are the appropriate times to use certain words and certain grammatical concepts. If I were to rate the semantics pragmatics of Japanese, I would probably rate it at a 1. In my opinion, it's one of the hardest parts about learning Japanese because not only are you learning the language, you're basically attempting to learn an entire society's way of thinking and their culture along with it. Okay, but why does Japanese take so long to learn if it's so easy? Well, there are two main reasons I can think of. One of the main reasons is the amount of cognates between English and Japanese. If you were to learn a language like Spanish, you would already have a large amount of vocabulary before even starting. For example, in Spanish, definition is definición, car is carro, and photo is foto. Meanwhile, in Japanese, definition is teigi, car is kuruma, and photo is shashin. Because of this, an English speaker learning Spanish is going to have a big head start on vocabulary compared to an English speaker learning Japanese. You'll have to learn so many more words from scratch. A second reason it takes so long is the writing system. Japanese arguably has one of the hardest writing systems ever. They use 3 separate scripts, hiragana, katakana, and kanji. Hiragana and katakana are syllabaries, so you'll be able to learn them relatively quickly. However, kanji are Chinese characters. There are over 2,000 official Japanese kanji that you will need to learn how to use and pronounce and read. These Chinese characters don't explicitly tell you how to pronounce them. There are some tricks, but ultimately, you'll be memorizing how every kanji is pronounced. The optimist in you might say, okay, not bad still, just memorize 2,000 different pronunciations for each character. Well, here's the thing. There are typically at least 2 different pronunciations for each character, and there are some kanji that have up to 20 different pronunciations, like the kanji for life. How will you know what pronunciation to use? Well, there are some tips and tricks, but ultimately, once again, you'll just have to memorize. Despite this difficulty, this is Japanese writing, not the language itself. If I were to only rank the difficulty of Japanese based solely on the spoken language, I would say it's an extremely consistent language, which has grammatical rules that just make sense, at least to me. There are hardly any exceptions that you have to memorize, so the language feels very approachable in that sense. On top of this, the phonology of the language is really easy and accessible to a large amount of individuals from various language backgrounds. The only difficulty really comes from just how different the language is from English. You have to basically start learning the language from scratch with only a small amount of cognates to help you out. Overall, I'd rank the difficulty of Japanese from hardest to easiest at around 4.5 stars, maybe 4. Now, if I were to include the writing system, that's an entirely different story, which would severely drag this rating down. But anyways, if you're learning Japanese, tell me in the comments what you find to be the hardest and easiest aspect of the Japanese language. And thank you to my first Patreon supporters, Pango and Mari. I greatly appreciate your direct support of this channel. It means a lot. And it also means the world to me that people actually watch and enjoy these videos in general, so thank you all again. Anyways, I'll see you in the next video. Ciao!